The bells of Ashcombe rang for a wedding that was not yet arranged, and the man standing at the edge of the churchyard did not know he had been dead for 3 years. He had walked 11 miles from the coast road in borrowed boots, and the frost had not yet lifted from the long grass between the stones. He was thin, in the way that campaigns make a man thin, and there was a scar through his left eyebrow that had not been there when he left. He looked at the great house on the rise beyond the church, the house that had been his father's, and was meant to be his, and he saw a carriage he did not recognize drawn up before the doors, and a coat of arms on its panel that was his own. Inside that house at that same hour, a young woman named Clara Whitmore was being told for the second time, that morning, that she would make an excellent countess. She did not want to be a countess. She stood at the tall window of the morning room, with her hands folded against the front of a plain gray gown, and she watched the frost on the lawn, and she said nothing, because there was nothing she was permitted to say. To the household, she was the poor relation, the vicar's orphaned niece, taken in out of charity. And to the household, she had one function, which was to be grateful. She had learned to hold her gratitude the way one holds a full cup on a moving stair. You may already feel the shape of what is coming. Stay with it, because the shape is not the story. The story is who was seen and by whom and how late. 7 years before, 2 brothers had ridden out from Ashcombe in very different directions. The elder, Edmund, had taken a commission and gone to the war, because the estate could not carry 2 heirs, and he would not sit idle waiting for his father to die. The younger, Julian, had stayed. That had seemed the smaller life then. It did not seem the smaller life now. The old earl had died in the 3rd winter of Edmund's absence, and word had come back across the water that Edmund had fallen at a river crossing, whose name no one in Ashcombe could pronounce, and there had been a memorial with no coffin in it, and a black armband worn for the correct number of months. And then the title had settled onto Julian's shoulders like a coat cut for another man. Clara had come to Ashcombe in the 4th winter when the mourning was already old, and the new earl was already established. She had never met the brother in the churchyard stone. She knew him only as a profile in a portrait on the gallery stair, a young man in regimentals with a steadiness in the painted eyes that she had sometimes stopped to look at when the house was quiet, no one was counting her steps. She had thought, more than once, that the painter had caught something the family had since agreed to forget. Then she had gone on down the stair because the linens needed counting, and a poor relation who lingers before portraits is a poor relation who will be spoken to. The man in the churchyard did not go up to the house at once. He stood a long time among the stones until he found the one he was looking for, and he read his father's name on it, and beneath it he read his own. Edmund Ashcombe, it said, beloved son. And the years, both of them wrong, because he had not died in the year the stone claimed, and he was not dead at all. He knelt in the frost and put his gloved hand flat against the cold letters of his own name, and something in him that had held for 3 years of a prison camp and a long walk home came very quietly apart. To the men who had marched with him he had been the officer who did not leave the wounded. To the enemy who had held him he had been a number in a ledger exchanged too late for the war to remember him. To Ashcombe he was a stone. He had come home to a grave with his name on it, and a carriage at his door bearing his arms. And he understood, kneeling there, that a man could survive everything the world could do to his body and still arrive too late for his own life. He rose when he heard the church door. The vicar came out, an old man now, older than Edmund's memory of him, and stopped on the path, and went the color of the frost. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the old man said the name, Edmund, in a voice that broke on the 2nd syllable, and Edmund said quietly that yes, it was, and asked how long he had been dead. The vicar told him 3 years, on the stone, longer than that in the minds of the house. And there was to be a wedding, the vicar said, and stopped, because he had said it before he had thought, and there are some kindnesses that come too late to be kind. A wedding, Edmund said, between the earl and a lady of the district. The vicar did not meet his eyes. The earl, he said. Julian, your brother, and a young woman living at the house, a Miss Whitmore. A good girl, gently born but without means. And it was thought a suitable arrangement, and the banns were to be read within the fortnight. Edmund heard all of this standing among the graves in his borrowed boots, and he found that he had no feeling to attach to any of it, only the cold, and the 11 miles still in his legs, and the ringing that was not bells at all, but the long silence of 3 years finding its voice. He did not go to the house that day. He took a room at the inn on the coast road, under a name that was not his, and he lay awake through the night, listening to the sea, and he made himself a promise he would break before the week was out. He promised himself he would take nothing. He had died, and the world had arranged itself around the fact of his death, and there was a cleanness in that he thought he could accept. Julian had the title. Let Julian keep it. He would come home only long enough to be seen by the people who had loved him, and then he would go away again, to somewhere his own name was not carved in stone, and he would let the living have the living world. He held to that promise until the following afternoon, when he walked up to the house at last, and was shown by a footman who did not know him, into the long gallery to wait, and found Clara standing before his own portrait. She turned when the door opened. She had been looking up at the painted soldier, as she often did when she believed the house was empty, and she was caught, and her first thought was that she had been found idling and would be spoken to. Then she saw the man in the doorway, and she saw the scar through the eyebrow that the portrait did not have, and the thinness the portrait did not have, and the 7 years the portrait did not have. And she understood before her mind would let her say it, that the painting had stepped down from the wall. She did not scream. That was the first thing he noticed about her. That in the moment a sensible woman would have screamed, she instead went very still and put one hand out to the cold marble of the window-sill, steadying herself, keeping her feet. Her face had gone white, but her eyes did not leave his. "You are dead," she said. It was not a question. He said that he had heard as much, and that the stone was very fine, and that he was sorry to disappoint the mason. And Clara, who had been grateful and silent for 4 years, felt something rise in her that she had thought long since trained out, which was the wild, inappropriate desire to laugh. They stood a long while in the gallery with the dead man between them. Alive? He asked her name, and she gave it. He said he knew of her, that the vicar had spoken of a wedding, and he watched her face when he said it, and he saw the thing pass across it that she would not have shown a soul in that house. She did not want the wedding. She had never once said so, and she did not say so now. But he had spent 3 years learning to read men who could not speak freely, and he read her the way he had learned to read them, in the set of the jaw and the stillness of the hands, and he knew. Then Julian came in, and the temperature of the room changed. You will want to know at once whether the younger brother was a villain. He was not. That is the harder truth, and the truer one. Julian Ashcombe had been 22 when the news came, across the water, and grief had been real in him, and he had worn the black armband, not as a costume, but as a wound. He had not wanted the title. He had wanted his brother back. And then the years had passed as they do, and the title had stopped feeling like a coat cut for another man, and started feeling like his own skin, and a man cannot go on for 3 years being an earl without beginning, somewhere he does not examine, to need to be one. When he came into the gallery and saw the thin, scarred man beside Clara, he knew him in an instant. The way you know a voice in the dark, and the joy in his face was real. Edmund saw it, and was undone by it. Julian crossed the room and took his brother by both shoulders and could not speak, and for a moment there was nothing in either of them but the 2 boys who had ridden out from Ashcombe 7 years before. Clara, standing apart, saw the joy in the younger man's face, and saw a half-second behind it, the other thing that moved through it and was gone, and she filed that half-second away because a woman who lives on charity learns to notice the thing that comes a half-second behind the joy. That night they dined together, the 3 of them, in a room built to seat 30. And it was the strangest meal of Clara's life. The brothers spoke of the years. Edmund told almost nothing of the prison camp, and Julian did not press. and Clara understood that the not telling was itself a kind of telling. Julian spoke of the estate, of the improvements he had made, the new drainage on the low fields, the tenants' cottages re-roofed, and there was pride in it, honest pride, and beneath the pride a question he did not ask aloud, and the question was, what became now of all this that he had made his own? Edmund did not ask for anything. He said, over the wine, that he was glad to see the estate flourishing, and that he had come only to be seen, and that he would not stay. Julian said too quickly that of course he must stay, that this was his home. And the word home sat on the table between them like a dropped glass that has not yet finished breaking. Clara watched the two men not look at each other, and she thought, neither of them will say the thing. And she was right. Neither of them would say the thing for a long time, and in the space where the unsaid thing lived, the trouble would grow. She found him the next morning in the stable-yard before the house was properly awake. She had gone out because she could not sleep, and he had gone out because he had never in 7 years learned again how to sleep past dawn, and they met by the water trough with the frost still on the cobbles, and their breath white in the air between them. He was gentling a horse that did not know him, and she stood at the gate and watched, and neither of them spoke for a while. And it was not an uncomfortable silence. "You should stay," she said at last. "Not because I say so, because it is yours." He looked at her over the horse's neck. "It was mine," he said. "A man can be replaced in 3 years. The living have the world." She heard the flatness in it, the settled grief of a man who has decided to want nothing, and something in her rebelled against it. She had spent 4 years wanting nothing, and she recognized the discipline of it, and she recognized, too, that it was a slow way of dying while upright. "Come inside," she found herself saying absurdly, as though she were the mistress of the house and he the stray. "You will take a chill." He looked at her a moment longer. Then, to her astonishment, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. And he came. The dismissive word for Clara at Ashcombe was charity. She heard it that same week from the housekeeper, Mrs. Penhallow, not cruelly but as plain fact, spoken to a new maid in the passage who had asked what was owed to Miss Whitmore, in the matter of precedence. "She is here on the Earl's charity, Mrs. No." Penhallow had said, "And a charity does not go before the family." Clara had been on the other side of the passage door, and she had stood very still with a stack of folded linen in her arms. And she had gone on to the linen press when the voices moved off, because a stack of linen does not fold itself, and a poor relation does not weep in passages. Edmund saw more of her in the days that followed than either of them intended. He had meant to keep to the promise, to be seen and to go, but the leaving kept not happening. He told himself it was Julian who delayed him. The honest joy of the reunion, the estate business that a returned heir could not decently ignore. He did not tell himself it was the woman in the gray gown who was always where the household did not look, doing the small necessary things no one thanked her for, defending a scullery child from a false accusation one afternoon with a quiet, flat certainty that stopped the accuser mid-sentence. He saw that, he had not been meant to see it. He had come round the corner of the kitchen garden and stopped unseen, and watched Clara stand between a frightened boy and a furious steward and take the whole weight of the steward's temper onto herself with a stillness he had last seen in men under fire. The boy had not broken the glass. Clara had seen who did. She did not name him. She simply stood and absorbed and did not move until the storm spent itself against her and passed. He went away from the garden without letting her know he had been there. Something had shifted in him that would not shift back, and he was soldier enough to know the difference between a position held and a position lost. The wound Edmund carried was not the prison camp, though the camp had marked him. The wound was a man named Harkness, a fellow officer, a friend, who had died at the river crossing that the stone in the churchyard credited with Edmund's own death. They had been taken together. Harkness had been the weaker of the two, fevered, and in the long negotiation of the camp, There had come a day when one man might be moved to the sick quarters, where there was a doctor, and only one, and Edmund had argued for Harkness and had prevailed, and Harkness had died there anyway 3 days later alone while Edmund lived. Edmund had come home believing, in the place where man keeps the things he cannot look at directly, that he had spent his own death on a man who died regardless, and that living was therefore a debt he had not earned and could not repay. That was why he wanted nothing. A man who believes he stole his own survival does not feel entitled to a house. He told none of this to anyone. Clara, though, who had learned to read the half-second behind the joy, began to read him too, and one gray afternoon in the library, with the rain coming down the tall windows and the fire low, she asked him plainly why a man would walk 11 miles home and then refuse to come in the door. And he found, to his own surprise, that he answered her. Not all of it. Enough, though. He named Harkness. He said the name once low the way you set down something you have carried too far. And Clara did not fill the silence after it with comfort, which is the thing most people cannot help doing, and the thing he could not have borne. She let the name sit in the room. Then she said only that a doctor and a chance were more than most men are given, and that giving them was not the same as taking a life. He looked at her a long moment. It was the first time in 3 years anyone had said a thing about it that did not slide off him. The banns were not read that fortnight. Julian delayed them, and did not say why. And Clara did not ask, and the whole house understood without a word being spoken that the ground had moved. A wedding arranged around the fact of Edmund's death could not proceed unaltered around the fact of his life, and yet the arrangement had been made, and papers had been drawn. And Julian was a man who had learned to hold what came to him. He watched his brother and Clara, in the library, in the stable yard at the long table, and he saw what was growing, and he was not villain enough to pretend he did not see it, nor saint enough to step aside without a struggle. It came to its edge on the night of the Marlowe ball. The neighborhood had waited 7 years for a sensation, and now had 2. The return of the dead heir and the question of the wedding, and the Marlowe's ball was the first arena large enough to hold the county's curiosity. Clara did not want to go. She was told she would go, because the Earl's household would attend entire and a poor relation attends where she is placed. She wore a gown that had been made over twice, cream once, now closer to no color at all, and she stood at the edge of the Marlowe's bright rooms among women whose diamond she had helped indirectly to make possible. And she was, as she had always been at such gatherings, invisible. Lady Marlowe's sister, a widow named Mrs. Cardew who had appointed herself the county's memory, said the word that night for the 2nd time, and said it loudly enough to be a public thing rather than a passage thing. She said to a knot of listeners, near enough to Clara that Clara could not pretend not to hear, that it was a curious household indeed, where a charity case was permitted to stand about as though she were owed a partner, and that the late Earl would not have countenanced it, and that whatever the young men imagined they saw in the girl, the county saw a governess who had misplaced her position. Charity. The word went round the little circle like a coin being passed. Clara held her cup on its moving stair. She had 4 years of practice. She did not flush, or not visibly, and she did not leave, because leaving would have been a kind of admission. She stood, and she absorbed the way she had stood in the kitchen garden between the boy and the steward, and across the room Edmund, who had been trapped in a conversation about drainage with a man who cared nothing for it, went still in the particular way he went still, the way she had begun to be able to feel where he was, in any room, and she thought, with something close to panic, that he must not. Whatever you are about to do, do not. It will cost you the house. He did not cross the room. Not then. He was soldier enough to know the ground was wrong, that a scene in the Marlowe's ballroom would harm her more than it healed, would make her the thing the county said she was. He held. Something in his face had changed all the same, and Mrs. Cardew, who read faces for a living, saw the change and misread it as the county wished to read it, and pressed, and asked Edmund directly, across the turning heads, whether it was true that the returned heir meant to renounce his own title and leave his brother the Earl as the strange rumor went. And Edmund, who had told no one his intention, understood that Julian had told someone, and understood in the same instant, a great deal about the shape of the coming days. He said levelly that a man's arrangements were his own, and that he would trouble the county with them when they were made. It was a courtier's answer, and it satisfied no one, and it ended the exchange. He had seen Julian across the room during it, and Julian had not met his eyes, and the thing that had been unsaid between the brothers for a fortnight had just been said, obliquely, in a stranger's ballroom, by a widow with a grievance and a good ear. They did not speak on the drive home. The carriage held all three of them, and a silence like a fourth passenger. Clara looked out at the dark fields and thought that she had cost the brothers their peace merely by existing where she was placed, and the old lesson rose in her, the lesson of the charity case, which is that the safest thing a dependent woman can do is to want nothing and be nowhere. She resolved in the dark carriage to leave Ashcombe. She would write to a former governess of her acquaintance who kept a school, and she would go and teach, and she would take herself out of the space between the brothers. Before that space did the family an injury it could not mend. It was, she told herself, the only decent thing. It was also the thing 4 years of Ashcombe had trained her to believe she deserved, and she could not, in the dark, tell the two apart. She did not know that Edmund had reached that same night the opposite decision, and by the opposite road. The dark moment, when it came quietly, as the worst of them do. It was 3 mornings after the ball. Clara had written her letter, and had it ready to post, and had told no one. Edmund had spent those 3 mornings in the estate office with the steward and the ledgers, and Julian had watched him do it with a face growing daily more closed, and on the 3rd morning, the brothers had the conversation at last that they had been not having since the gallery. Clara did not mean to overhear it. She was in the small book room that adjoined the office, returning a volume, and the office door was ajar, and she could not cross the passage again without being seen, and so she stood trapped with the book in her hands, and heard the 2 men she had come to care for take the estate apart between them. Julian's voice was not cruel. That was the terrible thing. It was reasonable. He said that Edmund had been dead 3 years, in law as well as in fact, that the succession had been confirmed, that the tenants knew him, Julian, as their earl, that the drainage and the roofs and the school he meant to build were his work, and would go on being his work, and that Edmund, whom he loved, whom he had grieved, could not simply walk in from a grave and unmake 3 years of a living man's labor. He said that he had thought Edmund meant to renounce, that Edmund had said as much, that the whole neighborhood now believed it, and that to reverse it now would make them both a spectacle and the estate a battleground, and would ruin, he said, the one thing they had left in common, which was the name. He asked his brother, not coldly, whether Edmund had come home to claim a house or to claim a woman, and whether he knew the difference, and whether Clara was worth the wreck of everything their father had built. And Edmund in the office was silent for a long time. Clara, in the book room, heard the silence, and her heart went down through the floor, because she thought she knew what a soldier's silence meant, and she thought it meant he was counting the cost and finding her too dear. Then Edmund said quietly that he had not come home to claim anything, that Julian was right about the years and right about the tenants and right, very likely, about the name. He said the title could stay where it had settled. He would sign whatever renunciation the lawyers required. And Clara, behind the door, felt the letter in her pocket become the only true thing in the house, and turned to go silently, before the tears could arrive, because a charity case does not weep in passages. And she had almost reached the far door when she heard him say the rest of it. But not the woman, Edmund said. The house is yours, and the name is yours, and I will sign it all away by Tuesday. Clara Whitmore is not part of the estate, and you will not dispose of her in the settlement as though she were a farm to be tenanted. She is not a suitable arrangement. She is not charity. And if you marry her, to keep her, or to keep the appearance of a thing already promised, you will do it over my open objection in front of the whole county, and I will not be quiet, and I do not care what it costs the name. There was a silence in the office then of a different quality. Clara stood at the far door with her hand on the latch and did not go through it. She heard Julian say after a while, in a voice that had lost its reasonableness and found something younger underneath it, that Edmund had always been the one who did not leave the wounded, and that he supposed that had not changed, and that he, Julian, and Plek, and had been about to marry a woman he did not love because it was arranged, and because it kept the girl safe and the household tidy, and because it was easier than admitting he had built his whole life inside another man's absence. And Edmund said that no one who married for tidiness had ever kept anything worth the keeping. And the two brothers who had ridden out from Ashcombe 7 years before, in very different directions, stood in the estate office among the ledgers, and were, for the first time since the gallery, simply brothers again, and the estate could go hang. Clara did not let them find her there. She went out through the bookroom and into the cold garden, and stood among the bare rose stems with her letter in her pocket. And she did not post it that day, and she did not quite know why, except that a man had said her name in a room where she was not meant to hear it, and had said it as though it weighed the same as a house. Now the county was owed a reckoning, and reckonings in that country happened where the county could see them. It happened at the Ashcombe dinner, the one Julian had planned months before as the setting for the announcement of his wedding. The guest list already sent, 30 families, the same faces that had turned at the Marlowe ball, the same Mrs. Shubble. Cardew seated near the foot of the table with her good ear and her long memory. The dinner could not be recalled without a scandal, and so it went forward, and the whole county came up the drive in the early dark to see how the strange business at Ashcombe would resolve. And most of them came expecting to watch a poor relation quietly removed and a suitable match confirmed. Clara was seated far down the table below the salt in the place a charity case is placed, in her twice-made gown. She had asked Julian privately that morning whether she might be excused, and Julian had looked at her with an expression she could not read, and told her gently that she would sit at the table and that she would not be below the salt for long. She had not understood him. She had gone down to dinner braced for humiliation, and resolved to bear it as she bore all things, upright, holding the cup. The soup was served. The talk ran on the returned heir who sat at his brother's right hand, thin and scarred and quiet, and who answered the county's curiosity in level sentences that gave it nothing. Mrs. Cardew, 3 glasses in, and unable to help herself, said the word a third time down the length of the table, in the tone of a woman doing the company a service. She said she supposed that now the succession was to be regularized, the household would be regularized also, and that the charity the late Earl's family had extended to Miss Whitmore, generous as it was, could not sensibly extend to a place at the family's own table, and that everyone present understood, surely, the difference between kindness and confusion. The table went quiet. It was the quiet Clara knew, the quiet of a room deciding a verdict about her while she sat inside it. She set her spoon down. She did not flush. She had 4 years of practice, and she meant to use every year of it, and she lifted her eyes to some neutral point above the candles, and prepared to be one final time invisible. Edmund Ashcombe stood up. He did not do it quickly. He rose the way a man rises when he has decided a thing all the way down without haste, and the scrape of his chair on the floor was the loudest sound the room had heard all evening. The county turned. Julian at the head of the table did not tell him to sit. Julian set down his own glass, and folded his hands and waited. And there was in the younger brother's face, not fear, but something that looked to Clara almost like relief. Edmund did not cross the room in 3 strides. He walked the length of the table, past the good families and the diamonds in the good ear, past the salt, and he stopped behind Clara's chair, and the whole county watched the returned Earl walk down below the salt to stand behind the charity case, and could not make its face do anything at all. He said, into the silence, 7 words. "She is the woman I am marrying." That was all. He did not make a speech. He did not answer Mrs. Cardew or defend Clara's birth or catalogue her worth, or shame the county for its verdict. He set the sentence down in the middle of the table like a man laying a sword flat, and he let it lie there, and the not saying of anything more was the whole of the force of it. Clara sat very still beneath his hand, which had come to rest on the back of her chair, not touching her, and she felt the room turn, and she understood that the verdict she had sat inside for 4 years had just been reversed by the one voice in the county that outranked all the others, and that she had done nothing to earn it but be, for once, seen. Mrs. Cardew's mouth opened and did not find a sentence. She looked to the head of the table for the correction that would restore the order she had spent the evening defending. And Julian Ashcombe, earl of a house he had built inside his brother's absence, looked back at her, and said, in the level voice of a man who has just set down something heavy, that his brother had the right of it, and that Miss Whitmore would not sit below the salt in this house again, and that the wedding the county had come to hear announced was indeed to be announced, though not the one the invitations had implied. He raised his glass to his brother, and to Clara, and the raising of it was the procedural thing, the Earl's own confirmation, that told the county the matter was closed and could not be reopened by any widow's memory. The county, which had come to watch a poor relation removed, found itself drinking to her instead, and did so, because the county always in the end drinks to the verdict of the highest voice in the room. And many at that table, watching the thin, scarred man stand behind the girl in the made-over gown, found that they had known all along she was worth more than the place they had put her, and told each other so on the drive home, as though they had always thought it. Clara found Edmund afterward, on the terrace in the cold, away from the noise. She had gone out to breathe. He was already there, as she had somehow known he would be, looking at the dark fields, and she came and stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while, and their breath went up white together into the winter air. "You should not have done it," she said at last. "It will cost you." He said that he had spent 3 years believing his life was a debt he had stolen, and that a man who believes that will give away a house without a second thought, and had been about to. He had found, he said, that there was one thing in England he could not make himself give away, one thing he would fight the whole county for, and that the finding of it had told him something the prison camp had not. He had not stolen his survival. He had been kept alive for something. He looked at her when he said it, and he did not reach for her hand, though she felt the whole of the reaching in the way he did not, and the not touching was warmer than any touch she had known. "I wrote a letter," she said, "to go away. I did not post it." He asked why not. She said she did not know that morning, but that she knew now, and she took the letter from the pocket where it had lived for 6 days, and held it a moment in the cold. And then she did not tear it up, because that would have been a gesture, and she was not a woman for gestures. She only put it back in her pocket unposted, done with, and that was answer enough, and he understood it, and the corner of his mouth moved in the ghost of the smile she had first surprised out of him in the stable yard, and this time it finished becoming one. They were married in the spring in the church at Ashcombe by the old vicar whose voice had broken on Edmund's name in the churchyard, and it was a small wedding, smaller than the county expected, and warmer. Julian stood up with his brother. The matter of the title had been settled quietly, and without lawyers making a spectacle of it, in the way the two of them had settled it in the office among the ledgers, which was that Julian would hold Ashcombe, whose drainage and roofs and half-built school were his life's work and love. And Edmund and Clara would take the smaller estate at Ferndean that had come to the family through their mother, a good house with poor land that Edmund meant to make good, because a man who has walked home from the dead wants more than a great house, a piece of ground he can put in order with his own hands. There is a stone in the churchyard at Ashcombe with Edmund's name on it. He did not have it removed. He said when Clara asked that he had knelt at it once, believing it told the truth, and that it had, in a way, because the man who had knelt there had indeed died at that stone, the man who wanted nothing, the man who thought his living was a theft. That man was gone. The one who stood up from it was somebody else, and had a wife, and a piece of poor ground to make good, and did not need his name cut in marble to know he was alive. "Let the stone stay," he said. "It is a true stone about a man who is not here any more." On the first hard evening of the following winter at Ferndean, with the poor fields put half in order and the rest waiting for spring, they sat by the fire in a small warm room, and the snow came down past the tall window in the last of the light, and Clara had in her hands the letter she had never posted, gone soft at the creases from a year in a drawer. She had kept it. She was not sure why she had kept it, except that it was the last thing the charity case had written, and she was not the charity case anymore, and there is a use in keeping the last word of a self you have finished being. She did not read it. She leaned and put it into the fire, and watched the flame take the folded corner and run inward along the creases. And Edmund beside her did not ask what it was, because he knew. The two of them watched the letter that would have taken her away become light, and then warmth, and then nothing. While the snow came down outside the window she had at last some right to be standing at. Beyond the glass the fields lay white and level and waiting, and the fire held the small room against the dark, and somewhere behind them in the sleeping house, a clock she had wound herself marked the hour. She had come to a great house once and been placed below the salt and told to be grateful, and she had learned to hold a full cup on a moving stair. The stair had stopped moving. She set the cup down. She leaned her head against the shoulder of the man the world had buried and been wrong about. She watched the snow, and for the first time in longer than she could name, she wanted something, and had it, and did not have to be grateful to anyone at all for the having. If Clara and Edmund stayed with you, stay a moment longer, and tell me the line that held you. I will read every one.